It was exactly 1423 in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. On Captain Ibrahim Traoré's desk lay one of the most critical documents in diplomatic history. The document declaring British Ambassador Sir Jonathan Hartwell persona non grata and requiring him to leave the country within 48 hours, was prepared to shake not only relations between the two countries, but also Africa's balance with the West. The files in Traoré's hands contained evidence of covert operations conducted by the British Embassy in Burkina Faso, and this evidence was powerful enough to trigger a diplomatic crisis. The roots of the crisis dated back 2 weeks. Burkina Faso. Intelligence services had noticed unusual activity at the British Embassy. Ambassador Hartwell had conducted dozens of secret meetings not on his official schedule over the past 3 months, visited the country's critical mining regions, and established contact with opposition figures. The embassy's staff had also doubled in the past 6 months. The documents in the files showed that the British Embassy was conducting activities in Burkina Faso that exceeded diplomatic boundaries. The main objective of these activities was to closely monitor the country's political situation and encourage developments favorable to British interests. The team under Ambassador Hartwell's management was collecting detailed information about Burkina Faso's gold and other mineral reserves and trying to establish contact with people who could influence government policies. This discovery had both angered and disappointed Traoré. Relations between Britain and Burkina Faso had been following a positive trajectory in recent years. Trade volume was increasing, cooperation in education was developing, and cultural exchanges were taking place. Traoré viewed Britain as a constructive partner in Africa's development. However, these documents showed that the British government's true intentions were very different. Ambassador Hartwell's activities not only violated diplomatic rules, but also threatened Burkina Faso's national security. Among their critical documents, the most important was a summary of a report Hartwell had sent to London. This report contained statements that the current government's independence-oriented policies are straining traditional partnerships in the region, and this situation needs to be closely monitored. The report also included results of meetings with various political figures in Burkina Faso. When Traoré read these reports, he realized that he was facing not just a diplomatic violation, but an open sovereignty attack. Burkina Faso's independence was a value that had been won at great cost. After the country was freed from the colonial period, it had struggled for decades to achieve true independence, and now this independence was under threat again. However, this time the threat came not in the form of an open attack, but through sinister operations hidden under a diplomatic mask. Traoré's decision regarding this situation was not only legal and ethical, but also strategically necessary. Turning a blind eye to Ambassador Hartwell's activities would mean giving the green light to other countries to conduct similar operations to protect Burkina Faso's sovereignty. A clear stance needed to be taken against such activities. Therefore, the decision to expel the ambassador was both legally and politically correct. After the decision was made, the implementation phase was carried out in a highly professional manner and in accordance with diplomatic rules. Traoré first called the British ambassador to a private meeting. This meeting took place on March 23, 2024, at the Burkina Faso Presidential Palace. Ambassador Hartwell, who attended the meeting initially, could not grasp the seriousness of the situation. However, when the Traoré began to systematically present the evidence, the ambassador's facial expression began to change. "Your Excellency," said Traoré in a calm but determined voice, "we have comprehensive documents regarding the activities you and your team have been conducting in Burkina Faso. Thus, activities clearly violate international diplomatic rules and threaten our country's national security." Ambassador Hartwell's initial reaction was to deny these accusations. "Captain Traoré, these are serious accusations. The British Embassy always operates within the framework of international law and diplomatic rules. These claims are unfounded." However, Traoré responded with the documents he placed on the table. "Your Excellency, these documents are from reports you sent to London. Thus, reports clearly include intervention plans in Burkina Faso's internal affairs. We also have photographs and audio recordings documenting your personnel's covert intelligence activities." Faced with this evidence, Ambassador Hartwell's position changed. He could no longer deny, but began to claim that these activities were within the scope of normal diplomatic information gathering. However, Traoré did not accept this explanation. "Your Excellency," said Traoré, "normal diplomatic information gathering does not include organizing opposition leaders or making government change plans. Thus, activities are a clear violation of sovereignty. Therefore, we declare you and certain members of your personal persona non grata. We give you 48 hours. This decision shocked Ambassador Hartwell. In his 30-year diplomatic career, he had never encountered such a situation. His first reaction was to try to convince them to reverse this decision. "Captain Traoré, this decision could have very serious consequences. Relations between Britain and Burkina Faso could be damaged. I ask you to reconsider this." However, Traoré's response was clear. "Your Excellency, this decision has been made and is final. Protecting Burkina Faso's sovereignty is more important than anything else for us. It would be sad if our relations were damaged, but we cannot turn a blind eye to these activities." Following this meeting, the official process began. The Burkina Faso Ministry of Foreign Affairs prepared an official note announcing that the British ambassador had been declared persona non grata. The initial reactions in London were mixed. The British Foreign Ministry initially tried to characterize the situation as a misunderstanding, however. Traoré's statements to the press and the evidence he presented revealed the seriousness of the situation. British media began to follow this crisis with great interest. Important media outlets such as BBC and The Guardian reported the issue as significant news. Headlines reading, "Burkina Faso expels British ambassador," aroused interest in British public opinion. The existence of evidence documenting the ambassador's activities forced the British government to make explanations. The issue also began to be discussed in the British Parliament. Opposition parties began to question the government. The question, "What covert operations is the government conducting in Africa?" topped the parliamentary agenda. The Foreign Secretary tried to deny these accusations, but could not be convincing in the face of the strength of the evidence. Meanwhile, the people of Burkina Faso received Traoré's decision with support. This decision, taken to protect the country's independence, found positive response among citizens. Demonstrations organized in Ouagadougou showed support for the government's policies. Support messages also began to arrive from other African countries. Ghana, Mali, Senegal, and many other African countries announced their support for Traoré's decision. The African Union also stated that it defended Burkina Faso's sovereignty rights in London. However, the crisis gradually deepened. Foreign Secretary David Cameron characterized the situation as concerning and announced that diplomatic contacts with Burkina Faso would be reviewed. These reactions included the suspension of development aid to Burkina Faso. However, these reactions could not convince Traoré to back down. He was confident in his decision and ready to take any necessary steps to protect Burkina Faso's sovereignty. Despite London's harsh reactions when the 48-hour deadline expired, Ambassador Hartwell and some of his team were forced to leave the country. The tension experienced in Ouagadougou during these critical 48 hours was breathtaking. Ambassador Hartwell tried to reverse the situation until the last minute. The British Embassy, following instructions from London, made statements to local media and argued that this decision was based on misunderstandings. Hartwell even held private meetings with Traoré's close advisors, trying to soften the decision. The development that occurred, particularly in the 47th hour, was noteworthy. As a final move, Hartwell sent a private letter to Traoré, or Dot. In this letter, he apologized for past misunderstandings and promised more transparent cooperation in the future. However, Traoré did not find this letter sufficient. What was important for him was not just an apology, but a guarantee that the British government would completely stop such activities. In the final hours, the scenes at the airport also went down. In history, hundreds of Burkinabe citizens who came to witness Hartwell's departure were filled with both curiosity and national pride. Although the ambassador stated in his final statement that the situation was a temporary setback, everyone understood that this was a turning point in Burkina Faso's diplomatic history. The international dimension of this event was also important. Other Western countries closely followed the situation. France, Germany, and America sent solidarity messages to Britain. However, they also felt the need to review their own embassies. Activities, China and Russia, on the other hand, announced their support for Traoré's decision. This support showed that a new balance of power was forming in Africa. The traditional hegemony of Western countries was being questioned, and African countries were beginning to pursue more independent policies. The economic dimension of the crisis was also important. Britain was one of Burkina Faso's important trading partners. However, this crisis also affected economic relations between the two countries. British companies began to review their investments in Burkina Faso. The impact of this situation on other African countries was also significant. Many African leaders began to more closely monitor the activities of foreign embassies in their own countries. This created a new diplomatic consciousness in Africa. Traoré's decision also showed Africa's changing face. African leaders were no longer ready to bow to Western pressure. They were making bold decisions to protect their own interests and defend their sovereignty. Various diplomatic initiatives were made regarding the resolution of the crisis. The diplomatic contact efforts that lasted for months finally bore fruit. After 6 months of diplomatic contact, the British government announced through unofficial channels that it would take steps to correct the situation. In return, Traoré gave the green light for the appointment of a new British ambassador. During this process, both countries learned important lessons. Britain understood that it needed to be more careful in its diplomatic relations with African countries. It realized that traditional approaches were no longer sufficient, and that African leaders were more sensitive about sovereignty issues. For Traoré, this crisis strengthened his position in international diplomacy. It showed how a small country could effectively negotiate with great powers. This experience enabled him to be more confident in his future diplomatic decisions. The economic dimension of the crisis also produced important results. Although trade volume between Britain and Burkina Faso temporarily decreased, in the long term, both countries had to restructure their relations. This process aimed to create a more transparent and mutually respectful cooperation model. Diplomatic missions in other African countries were also affected by this event. Many African countries began to more closely monitor the activities of foreign diplomatic missions. This situation helped create a new diplomatic consciousness in Africa. From an international law perspective, this crisis brought new discussions about how and when persona non grata declarations could be used. The balance between diplomatic immunity and the host country's sovereignty rights began to be reconsidered in international law literature. This event also had important effects from a media perspective. Both British and African media developed new approaches to how they would handle diplomatic crisis. The role of social media also became important in this process as public reactions shaped faster than traditional diplomatic channels. The behind-the-scenes story of the crisis was also noteworthy. Traoré's intelligence team had been monitoring the British embassy's activities for months. During this process, Ambassador Hartwell's secret meetings at luxury hotels in Ouagadougou, his unexpected visits to different regions of the country, and his close relationships with local business leaders were scrutinized. Intelligence experts had determined that these movements went far beyond normal diplomatic activities, particularly Hartwell's inspections in Burkina Faso's gold mining regions were noteworthy. Although the ambassador tried to explain their visits within the framework of cultural and economic cooperation, it was understood that he was actually collecting detailed information about the mines' production capacity, security, situation, and future potential. This information was directly shared with British companies in London. The European dimension of the crisis had also created important developments. Countries like France, Germany, and Italy had closely followed this diplomatic crisis experienced by Britain. The embassies of these countries in Africa had to review their own activities. France, in particular, had focused on making its embassy's activities in Burkina Faso more transparent. The resonance of Traoré's decision in African media was also significant. From South Africa to Kenya, important newspapers of the continent had carried this event to their headlines. News published under the headline, "African Leaders' Brave Stance," emphasized that Traoré had created a new diplomatic model for Africa. This media support had further increased Traoré's prestige throughout the continent. The role of social media was also very important in this process. The hashtag #BurkinaFaso sovereignty had become trending on Twitter and Facebook, and millions of African diaspora members had supported Traoré's decision. This digital support had created public pressure beyond traditional diplomatic channels. The British government could not ignore this social media campaign and had to reevaluate its public diplomacy strategy. From an economic perspective, the short-term effects of the crisis remained limited. Burkina Faso's trade volume with Britain constituted only 8% of its total foreign trade. Therefore, the diplomatic tension had not seriously affected the country's economy. However, for Britain, the loss of prestige in Africa had broader economic consequences. British companies began to worry about facing similar reactions in other African countries. During the crisis resolution process, countries like Ghana and Senegal had undertaken mediation rules. The leaders of these countries had tried to prepare the ground for resolving the crisis by contacting both truer and British officials. Thus, mediation efforts had been a strong indicator of solidarity among African countries. International law experts had evaluated this crisis as a new turning point in 21st century diplomatic relations. How small countries could effectively resist great powers had become the subject of intense debate in academic circles. This crisis had begun to be taught as a case study at prestigious universities like Harvard and Oxford. This crisis had also been an important experience for Traoré's personal development. The 34-year-old leader had learned the intricacies of international diplomacy and gained valuable experience on how to negotiate with great powers. This experience had made him one of Africa's most experienced young leaders. The technical dimension of the crisis was also interesting. Burkina Faso's intelligence services had attracted the attention of other countries in the region, thanks to the technological methods they used during this operation. Neighboring countries like Mali and Niger had made cooperation proposals to develop Burkina Faso's intelligence capacity. The departure of British Ambassador Hartwell had also been a noteworthy event. When leaving from Ouagadougou Airport, the ambassador had told journalists that the friendship between Burkina Faso and Britain had suffered a temporary interruption. But these relations would be re-established more strongly in the future. This statement showed that the crisis had not been completely resolved, but had entered a constructive process. The appointment of the new British ambassador had also been done meticulously. London had this time chosen a diplomat with African experience and known for his respectful approach to local cultures. This choice was an indicator that Britain wanted to open a new page in its Africa policy. As a result, this diplomatic crisis had moved beyond being just a disagreement between two countries and had become a historical event that strengthened Africa's position in the international system. The leadership displayed by Traoré had become an example summarizing the character of Africa's new generation leaders. Traoré's decision gained important recognition in Africa. Other African leaders appreciated his consistent stance. This event became an important indicator of Africa's changing diplomatic approach. The diplomatic initiatives made regarding the resolution of the crisis bore fruit after long negotiations. After a diplomatic contact process lasting 6 months, the British government announced through unofficial channels that it would take steps to correct the situation. In return, Traoré gave the green light for the appointment of a new British ambassador. During this process, both countries learned important lessons. Britain understood that it needed to be more careful in its diplomatic relations with African countries. It realized that traditional approaches were no longer sufficient and that African leaders were more sensitive about sovereignty issues. For Traoré, this crisis strengthened his position in international diplomacy. It showed how a small country could effectively negotiate with great powers. This experience enabled him to be more confident in his future diplomatic decisions. The economic dimension of the crisis also produced important results. Although trade volume between Britain and Burkina Faso temporarily decreased, in the long term, both countries had to restructure their relations. This process aimed to create a more transparent and mutually respectful cooperation model. Diplomatic missions in other African countries were also affected by this event. Many African countries began to more closely monitor the activities of foreign diplomatic missions. This situation helped create a new diplomatic consciousness in Africa from an international law perspective. This crisis brought new discussions about how and when persona non grata declarations could be used. The balance between diplomatic immunity and the host country's sovereignty rights began to be reconsidered in international law literature. This event also had important effects from a media perspective. Both British and African media developed new approaches to how they would handle diplomatic crisis. The role of social media also became important in this process, as public reactions shaped faster than traditional diplomatic channels. As a result, this diplomatic crisis that lasted for a year contained important lessons for both Britain and Burkina Faso. When relations began to normalize, both countries focused on developing a more mature cooperation model based on mutual respect. This process strengthened Africa's position in the international system while showing that traditional diplomatic approaches also needed to evolve. Ultimately, this diplomatic crisis had moved beyond being just a disagreement between two countries and had become a historical event that strengthened Africa's position in the international system. The leadership displayed by Traoré had become an example summarizing the character of Africa's new generation leader.